The wind was cold that evening, sharp and unforgiving as it slashed against our skin. The Aegean Sea stretched out before us like an endless sheet of obsidian glass, broken only by the jagged cliffs rising out of the water. The sun had already dipped beneath the horizon, casting the sky into a deep bruise of purples and blacks. We had arrived in the village earlier that day, a cluster of whitewashed houses clinging to the rocks, as if afraid to be swallowed by the sea below. The locals spoke little English, but they didn't need to. Their eyes had said enough. You could feel it in the air, the way it pressed down on you, heavy, thick with something old, something dangerous. But we were tourists, right? We didn't believe in the ancient myths. Not really. Sure, we'd heard the stories, just like you hear ghost tales in every town you visit. We laughed them off, joked about it. But the truth? The truth has teeth. The tavern owner had warned us not to go near the cliffs after dark. He said the sirens came out then. Beautiful, he said, but deadly. Always singing. Always waiting. Stay away from the water, he whispered, his voice low like a prayer. We ignored him. Of course we did. After all, it's just a story. That's what we told ourselves. It wasn't long before the first one went missing. That night, the air was sticky with humidity. The scent of salt and something metallic lingered on the breeze. We drank too much, laughing, spinning tales of our own. Someone had dared us to walk down to the cliffs, to stand where the sea whispered and watch for the sirens, dared us to listen for their song. The waves crashed against the rocks below, louder than usual, or maybe it just felt that way after the drinks. The moon was high, casting long shadows over the jagged landscape. We stood at the edge, peering into the abyss, daring each other to step closer. That's when we heard it, faint at first, like a hum carried on the wind. A voice, soft, delicate, too far to understand but close enough to set your teeth on edge. I could see the others glancing around, nervous now, though no one wanted to admit it. "Do you hear that?" one of them whispered. Another laugh, forced, brittle. "It's just the wind," someone else said. But it wasn't. The voice grew louder, more distinct, sweet and mournful, like a lullaby spun from nightmares. It was seductive, pulling at something deep in your chest, something primal. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My stomach turned, a knot forming low in my gut. Then, without warning, one of us, the one who'd been the loudest, the most confident, turned and walked toward the cliffs. Just like that. No hesitation. No fear. He moved as if in a trance, his eyes wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead into the sea. "Hey, where are you going?" one of us shouted after him. But he didn't answer. His steps were steady, purposeful, as if someone was calling him. I watched, frozen, as he reached the very edge. My mouth was dry, the words stuck in my throat. We called again, but it was as though he couldn't hear us. Couldn't hear anything except her. Then he jumped. The splash came moments later, distant and muffled. We rushed to the edge, our hearts racing, but the water was calm. Too calm. There were no ripples, no signs of struggle, just the endless dark expanse of the sea stretching out before us. And he was gone. Panic set in. Shouts. Scrambling. But there was no trace of him. Nothing. That's when we heard the song again. Louder this time, closer. Too close. My heart thundered in my chest as I realized it wasn't coming from the sea. It was coming from behind us. We turned as one, the moonlight casting long shadows over the rocks. And there she stood. Her skin was pale, glistening like wet marble. Her hair dark as the deepest parts of the ocean. Her lips curved into a smile, too wide, too sharp. And her eyes, they were the color of the sea, endless and cold. She opened her mouth, and the song poured out, sweet and sickening, filling the air like poison. One of us screamed. Another stumbled back, tripping over the rocks. But it didn't matter. The song wrapped around us, tight, suffocating, pulling us closer to her. I could feel it in my bones, that urge to step forward, to drown in her voice, to let her pull me under. I fought it, but the others... I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, watching as one by one they disappeared into the sea, their eyes glassy, blank, as if their souls had already been swallowed whole. By the time the song faded, I was alone. The sea was silent. I don't remember how I got back to the village. One moment I was standing on the cliffs, the silence pressing down on me like a living thing, and the next, I was stumbling through the narrow, cobbled streets, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind felt foggy, like I'd walked through a nightmare, but the fear clung to me, sharp and real. It was only when I reached the square, the faint glow of the tavern's lights flickering in the distance, that I realized I was shaking. My hands were trembling uncontrollably, my legs barely holding me up. I was alone. They were all gone. The door to the tavern creaked open, spilling warm light onto the cold street. The old man from earlier, his face as weathered as the sea, stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing when he saw me. For a second, neither of us moved. His gaze flicked over my shoulder, scanning the empty street behind me, and his lips pressed into a thin, grim line. "They took them, didn't they?" His voice was low, almost resigned, like he'd seen this before, like he knew what was coming. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat felt like it had been ripped raw, every breath burning. All I could do was nod, a small, pathetic movement that made me feel like a child caught in a storm. He muttered something under his breath, something in Greek, before turning and disappearing inside. When he came back, he had a glass of something strong and foul-smelling in his hand. He shoved it into mine, his gaze hard and unforgiving. "Drink," I did. It burned like fire, but it jolted me back to reality, just for a moment. I could feel the world snapping back into focus, the sounds of the village coming alive around me. The distant crash of waves, the creak of wood as a shutter bangs somewhere in the distance, the hum of the night. "They won't stop," he said, his voice flat. "Once they have your scent, they won't stop." I stared at him, the words swimming in my head. "They won't stop." What? What the hell are they? My voice cracked, but I didn't care. I needed answers. I needed to know what had just happened out there on those cliffs. What she was. His eyes darkened, the kind of darkness that only comes from knowing something too awful to forget. He glanced out the window as if expecting to see something watching us from the sea. "The Sirens," he said simply. "Beautiful and deadly, like the stories say. But the stories don't tell you everything." He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of salt and something bitter, his voice dropping to a whisper, like what he was about to say was forbidden. "They're ancient, older than the gods, and they feed on the souls of men. Not just their bodies. No, their souls. The song, it's a trap. Once you hear it, you can't resist. It gets inside you, burrows deep, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The memory of that song, the way it had pulled at me, the way it had whispered promises I didn't even understand, crept back into my mind, unshakable. He was right. The song wasn't just sound. It was inside me, lingering, curling like smoke in my lungs. "You've been marked," he continued, his eyes locking onto mine. "They'll come for you next." I shook my head, not wanting to believe it, but deep down I already knew it was true. I could still hear the faint echo of the song, like it was waiting for me, calling me back to the cliffs. I hadn't escaped them. Not really. I had only delayed the inevitable. The old man grabbed my arm, his grip stronger than I expected. "There's only one way to stop them," he said, his voice urgent now. "You have to break the curse." "Curse?" I blinked, confused, my mind racing to catch up. "What curse?" He let go of my arm and turned away, walking toward a small table in the corner. His hands fumbled with a drawer, pulling out something wrapped in old, yellowed cloth. When he unwrapped it, I saw what looked like an ancient piece of parchment, the edges frayed and torn, the writing faded and strange. "This village," he began, "it's cursed, has been for centuries. The Sirens were summoned by an act of betrayal, and they've been feeding ever since. Every generation they take more. First it was the fishermen, then the sailors. Now, it's anyone who steps foot on those cliffs." He handed me the parchment, his fingers trembling as they brushed against mine. "This tells of how to end it. But it's not easy. There's a ritual. And a price." "A price?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me then, truly looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the fear in his eyes. "A life for a life," he said quietly. "One must be sacrificed to break the curse, and it won't be quick. The Sirens, they like to make it slow." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Sacrifice, ritual, death. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was insane, that this was all just a nightmare I hadn't woken up from. But the song, oh God, the song was still there, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting for me to let my guard down. And I knew, without a doubt, that the Sirens would come for me. Suddenly, the door slammed open, the wind howling through the gap like a scream. The lights flickered, the shadows in the corners stretching and warping. And then faintly, ever so faintly, I heard it. That song. But this time it was closer, so much closer. The song echoed in my ears, distant but unmistakable. My blood ran cold, every muscle in my body tensing like a coiled spring. The tavern felt suddenly smaller, its walls closing in as that sweet, terrible melody wrapped itself around my thoughts, tugging at something deep within me. The old man didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching me, his face pale and drawn, as if he already knew what was coming next. "They're here, aren't they?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. The song was unmistakable now, low and haunting, like a lullaby sung just for me. It slithered through the cracks in the windows, curled around the beams, seeped into my skin. It was the same sound that had stolen my friends, the same sound that had driven them into the sea. But now it was different. Now, it was for me. "They won't stop," the old man said again, his voice a hollow echo of his earlier warning. He grabbed the parchment from the table, shoving it into my hands with a frantic urgency. "You have to do the ritual. It's the only way." I stared down at the ancient, fragile paper, the faded symbols barely legible. My heart pounded in my chest, a drumbeat of fear that drowned out everything else. How could I stop something so ancient? So powerful? The very idea of it seemed impossible, ridiculous even. But the song, God, the song, was growing louder. "What if I don't?" I asked, my voice small, almost childlike. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window, his eyes narrowing as the wind howled louder, rattling the glass. The village beyond was dark, the faint glow of lanterns doing little to push back the night. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving out there, a shadow sliding between the houses, swift and unnatural, but then it was gone, lost to the swirling mist that had begun creeping in from the sea. "If you don't," he said slowly, his gaze still fixed on the darkness outside, "they'll take you, and it won't be quick." I didn't need him to explain. I'd seen enough. I knew what the Sirens did to their victims, how they dragged them into the sea, their bodies never found, their souls consumed by the depths. The thought of it, of being taken by them, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. My legs felt weak, my mouth dry. "But the ritual," I pressed, desperation clawing at my voice. "How do I—" Before I could finish, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the entire tavern shaking with the force of it. The old man and I both jumped, our eyes snapping to the door. The wind outside had risen to a fever pitch, screaming through the cracks in the walls like something alive, something hungry. And beneath it all, that song, louder now, closer. "They're coming," the old man muttered, backing away from the door, his eyes wide with fear. "They're coming for you!" My heart hammered in my chest, my hands clutching the parchment so tightly it crinkled under my grip. I wanted to run, to bolt for the back door and get as far from the cliffs as possible, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just some ghost story. This was real. The Sirens were real, and they were coming for me. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, dimming to almost nothing before sputtering back to life. The wind outside seemed to die for a moment, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. Then, without warning, the window shattered. Glass exploded inward, shards raining down like knives. I threw my arms up to shield my face, stumbling backward as the cold night air rushed into the room. The song, once distant and haunting, was now deafening. It filled the room, every note vibrating in my bones, every syllable wrapping itself around my heart, squeezing tighter and tighter. And then I saw her. She stood just outside the broken window, her silhouette framed by the jagged glass and the moonlight beyond. Her pale skin glowed in the dark, her long dark hair flowing around her like tendrils of smoke. She was beautiful, impossibly beautiful, but there was something wrong, something hideously wrong. Her eyes, those cold, dead eyes, locked onto mine, and for a moment, everything else faded. The tavern, the wind, the shattered window, it all disappeared. All I could see was her. She smiled then, a slow, twisted smile that sent a bolt of icy fear down my spine. Her lips parted, and I could see the sharp glint of teeth, too sharp, too many. And her voice, oh God, her voice, was inside my head now, filling my thoughts, drowning out everything else. "Come to me." The words were like honey, sweet and sickening, pulling at something deep within me. I could feel myself moving toward the window, my body acting on its own, my feet carrying me closer to her without my permission. The song was everything now, all-encompassing, a sound so pure and so deadly that I could no longer think. "Stop!" The old man's voice broke through the fog, distant and fading. "Don't listen!" But I couldn't stop. I needed to go to her. I needed to drown in her song. I was halfway to the window when something cold and sharp clamped down on my wrist, yanking me backward. The old man was there, his grip iron tight, his eyes wild with terror. He shouted something I couldn't make out through the haze of the song, but his grip was strong, pulling me away from the siren's call. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the song stopped. I gasped, the weight of it lifting from my mind, the spell breaking. My body shook with the effort of resisting her pull, my chest heaving with panicked breaths. The siren, still standing in the shattered window, tilted her head, her eyes narrowing in frustration. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. "Run!" the old man hissed, pulling me toward the back of the tavern. "We have to get out of here!" But I barely had time to move before a scream tore through the night. It wasn't mine. It wasn't his. It was someone else, a woman, and it was coming from the sea. The scream ripped through the night, cutting through the air like a blade. It wasn't the same as the song, the haunting melody that had burrowed into my mind, but something else, something raw, primal, filled with agony and fear. It was a sound that clawed at my insides and left me frozen in place. The old man's grip on my wrist tightened, his eyes darting toward the sea, where the cliffs loomed like jagged teeth against the night sky. "We don't have much time," he rasped, his voice trembling with urgency. "They've started." What do you mean, started?" I stammered, my voice cracking under the weight of the terror gnawing at me. "They're claiming another soul," he whispered, his face pale as death. "The sirens, they're never satisfied. Once they take one, they always take more. And tonight, they won't stop until they've had their fill." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My legs felt like lead, but the old man was already dragging me toward the back of the tavern, moving faster than his age should have allowed. His grip was like iron, and I could hear the fear in his breath, sharp and ragged, as we burst through the back door into the narrow alley behind the tavern. The village was eerily quiet now, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. The wind had died completely, leaving the air thick with an oppressive stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "We need to go to the chapel," the old man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the only place they can't reach us." I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the pale, twisted figure of the siren stalking us through the darkness, but the alley was empty, save for the shadows that clung to the stone walls like black mold. Still, the air felt wrong, heavy, like something was watching. We hurried through the narrow streets, the old man leading the way, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The scream from the sea had faded, but the tension remained, thick and palpable, as if the village itself was holding its breath. Then without warning, the song started again. It was faint at first, barely a whisper carried on the breeze, but it grew with each passing second, wrapping itself around us like a noose tightening around our throats. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears as I felt the pull of it, that same insidious, seductive force that had nearly drawn me to my death on the cliffs. "Don't listen!" the old man shouted, his voice desperate, his hand clutching my arm so hard it hurt. "Keep moving, keep your mind clear!" But it was impossible to ignore. The song was everywhere, filling the air, seeping into my thoughts, clawing at my sanity. I could feel it pulling me, beckoning me to turn back, to walk into the sea, to let the cold, dark water swallow me whole. I stumbled, my legs betraying me as the pull grew stronger, but the old man yanked me forward, his strength astonishing for someone so frail. "We're almost there!" he cried, his voice shaking. "The chapel is just ahead!" I blinked, forcing myself to focus, and saw it. The small, weathered building at the end of the street, its white stone walls glowing faintly in the moonlight. It was old, ancient even, and it radiated a kind of solemn, protective power that felt like a lifeline in the drowning pull of the siren's song. We reached the door just as the song reached a fever pitch, the melody sharp and sweet, like shards of glass cutting through the air. The old man fumbled with the heavy iron latch, his hand shaking, but finally the door creaked open, and we stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. The instant the door closed, the song stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. My ears rang from the sudden absence of sound, my chest heaving as I gasped for breath. The chapel was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of a single candle flickering near the altar. The air inside was thick with the scent of incense and dust. The walls lined with faded icons of saints, watching us with hollow, empty eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, catching our breath, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us like a physical force. Then slowly, the old man turned to me, his face drawn and pale in the candlelight. "We're safe here," he said, his voice hoarse. "For now." I sank to the floor, my legs giving out beneath me, my mind still reeling from the song. It had been so close, too close. If the old man hadn't been there, I didn't want to think about what would have happened. but something still didn't make sense. "What did you mean when you said they've started?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do they want? Why are they doing this?" The old man's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe? Or something darker. He walked to the altar, his hand shaking as he lit another candle. The flame danced in the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows on the stone walls. "They were summoned," he said quietly. "Years ago, by the people of this village." I blinked, not sure I'd heard him right. "Summoned? You mean on purpose?" He nodded, his face grim. "It was a long time ago. This village was dying. Plague, famine, all of it. The elders made a pact, a dark one. They called upon the Sirens, offering them the souls of outsiders in exchange for protection, for prosperity. But the price was steep, too steep." My blood ran cold as his words sank in. The villagers had made a deal with these things, sacrificing anyone who wandered too close to the cliffs. The tourists, the sailors. They were all bait, all unwitting victims of this ancient curse. "But it's gotten worse," the old man continued, his voice shaking. "The Sirens. They've grown greedy. They don't just want outsiders anymore. They want us. And tonight, they'll take whoever they can get." I felt sick. My skin crawled with the realization of what we were up against. This wasn't just some myth, some old wives' tale spun to keep children away from the sea. This was real, and there was no escape. The candle flickered, casting a shadow across the room, and then I saw her. Standing in the far corner of the chapel, half hidden in the darkness, was a woman. No, not a woman, a siren. Her eyes were locked onto mine. Her pale lips curled into that same twisted smile I had seen before. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I could hear her voice in my head, soft and sweet, like a lullaby whispered in the dark. "Come to me." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I could feel the pull again, stronger than before. The urge to stand, to walk toward her, to let her take me. But before I could move, the old man grabbed me, yanking me to my feet. "She's inside!" he shouted, his voice breaking with terror. "We have to run!" But it was too late. The door to the chapel exploded inward with a deafening crash, and standing in the doorway, framed by the howling wind and the darkness beyond, was another siren. And behind her, there were more. So many more. The air was sucked out of the room the moment the door exploded inward. Cold wind surged into the chapel, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of the sea, salt and rot, decay and death. I could barely breathe as I stared at the figures standing in the doorway, their bodies pale and slick with water, their eyes glowing with something ancient, something hungry. There were 5 of them, 5 sirens, their haunting beauty twisted into something grotesque. Their lips were curled into that familiar smile, wide, too wide, like the jaws of a predator before it strikes. They were here to claim me, and there was no place left to hide. Behind me, the old man was muttering prayers under his breath, his voice shaking as he fumbled with the parchment. But I knew it was too late. Whatever hope he'd clung to, the ritual, the chapel's protection, none of it mattered now. The sirens were inside. They had broken the sacred threshold, and there was no escape. The one closest to me, the one who had first appeared in the shattered window, stepped forward. Her movements were slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. The others followed, their song beginning to hum low in the air, vibrating through the stone walls, filling every corner of the chapel. I could feel it already, wrapping around my mind, squeezing tighter and tighter until it was hard to think, hard to breathe. "Stop," I whispered, though my voice was barely audible. My feet refused to move, my body paralyzed by the weight of the song. My mind was clouded, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. It was like I was trapped inside my own body, watching as death crept closer, inch by inch. The old man's voice rose behind me, louder now, desperate. He clutched the parchment, his eyes wild as he shouted something in Greek. A prayer, a curse, I couldn't tell, but the sirens didn't stop. If anything, they seemed amused, their eyes glinting with dark delight as they closed the distance. One of them, her skin glistening in the dim candlelight, moved faster than the others. In a blink, she was beside the old man, her hand clamping down on his throat with inhuman strength. His words died in his mouth as her long, talon-like fingers squeezed tighter, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything, but the song was too strong now. It thrummed inside my skull, drowning out everything else. I could barely hear the sickening crack of bone as the old man's body crumpled in her grip. His lifeless form fell to the floor with a dull thud, the parchment slipping from his hands, useless. And still the song continued. The lead siren, the one with the dark hair and dead, glistening eyes, moved toward me, her smile widening, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. She reached out, her fingers brushing against my cheek, cold as ice. Come to me. Her voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was everywhere, filling the air, vibrating in my bones. I could feel myself giving in, my will slipping away, my body responding to her command. The others surrounded me now, their voices harmonizing, the song swelling in volume until it was all I could hear, all I could feel. I was theirs. I stepped forward, my legs moving without my consent, drawn toward the siren. Her eyes glowed with triumph, her hand reaching out to take mine, to pull me into the darkness with them. The sea was calling. The water, cold and endless, was waiting to claim me. And then, just as her fingers grazed mine, I heard something else, a sound. Distant, faint, but unmistakable. It was another voice. But this one wasn't sweet or seductive. This one was screaming. I froze, my mind snapping back to reality, the haze of the siren song lifting just enough for me to hear it clearly. The scream was coming from the sea, the same scream I'd heard earlier, the one that had sent shivers down my spine. But this time, it wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of rage. The sirens paused, their heads snapping toward the door as the sound grew louder, closer. Their smiles faltered, their eyes narrowing in confusion, then fear. And then I saw her. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the stormy sky, was a figure, a woman, but she wasn't like the sirens. Her skin was not pale and slick with seawater. It was cracked, dry, her flesh peeling away to reveal the bones beneath. Her hair, matted and tangled with seaweed, clung to her skeletal frame like a shroud, and her eyes burned with fury, glowing with an unnatural light that made the sirens recoil in terror. She screamed again, a sound so full of hatred and pain that it shook the very walls of the chapel. The lead siren snarled, her twisted smile gone, replaced with something primal, something afraid. She stepped back, her eyes flicking between me and the figure in the doorway. The song faltered, the harmony breaking as the sirens hissed and shrank away from the woman. And in that moment I realized the truth. She wasn't just another victim. She wasn't part of their cursed, seductive song. No, she was something else entirely. She was their mother. The old man had been right. The curse on the village had been born from a betrayal, an act so dark and twisted that it had summoned the sirens from the depths. But the villagers hadn't just summoned the sirens. They had summoned her, the mother of the sirens, the source of their power, and she was angry. The sirens shrieked as the woman stepped forward, her skeletal fingers reaching for them, her voice no longer a scream but a command. They tried to flee, but the chapel walls seemed to close in, trapping them. Their beauty, their hypnotic allure, faded as the mother's presence grew stronger. Their bodies twisted and contorted, their once perfect forms cracking and breaking as they writhed in agony. I stumbled back, watching in horror as the sirens were reduced to nothing more than broken shells, their voices silenced, their power drained. The mother's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I thought she would turn on me, that her wrath would consume me as well. But instead she smiled, and then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone, the wind sweeping her away, leaving only the shattered remains of the sirens in her wake. The chapel was silent. I stood there, alone, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a leaden blanket. The sirens were gone, the curse broken. But the cost was something I would never forget. I turned to leave, my legs shaking beneath me, and as I stepped outside into the cold night air, I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, a song,